All right, we are live. At least one can never tell right off the bat on YouTube, but one thinks one is live or that we are live. So, um, joining me today, as usual, is a very special guest. So, Biyu, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do for those who might not know you before we begin.
Yeah, sure. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I work in the human neuroscience space. So I do both basic neuroscience in humans, which is most of my work. I also do some clinical neuroscience, taking what we find in healthy volunteers to pursue some of the potential clinical applications. I'm at NYU. I'm affiliated with neurology, neuroscience, radiology, and biomedical imaging. And I'm very interested in consciousness. I've been working on consciousness for quite a while. So
Yeah,
glad to be here.
thank you. I'm glad that you're here. You're one of the scientists that I really admire and respect because you openly talk about consciousness and are interested in researching it. And as we know, there's kind of been a history, or at least a certain tendency amongst certain kinds of researchers to think to look down on consciousness as maybe not something that's so scientifically serious. So I wonder just before we begin if you, and I know you organize a big kind of maybe a conference or something on the
A
future of
workshop,
yeah, a
yeah.
workshop. So I just wonder, like amongst neuroscientists, is that really a prevalent idea or attitude that consciousness science is not as serious as say like attention science or something like that?
I would say that used to be the case,
Hmm.
especially like maybe 15, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, but less and less so these days. Thankfully, there has been a change in attitude from both working scientists all the way to editors at journals and even grant funders. I think there has been this shift in mindset that consciousness science is not rigorous. Consciousness is a topic that is not scientifically approachable. Those ideas, which used to be somewhat prevalent, as you say,
Hmm.
are less and less embraced. I hope that trend continues, and I think it's to a large extent due to the just high quality work, very rigorous theoretical and especially empirical work that's really up to the standards of modern neuroscience over the last 10, 15 years. And it's really increasing in exponential curve in terms of the volume.
Hmm.
And that really has created this mind shift in people.
Yeah, and so you think that that attitude is sort of changing generally in the sciences? Because I'm hoping that we're seeing a kind of change in the way that we think of the science of consciousness, going from like a niche area to a kind of standard area where even if you don't, the way I think of it is that even if you don't have a like generally accepted theory, you would kind of know which ones to put in your textbook. And like for
Mm.
attention, we kind of know that. Like if you have a textbook on attention, you sort of you know what to expect in there and what the controversies are. But when it comes to consciousness, I feel like we're still kind of not at that point. And one textbook will have a large section on focusing on like one theory, like IIT, and the other one will have nothing at all on theories. So anyway, so I'm not sure that we have a kind of discipline-wide consensus on like what we would include in an introductory cognitive neuroscience textbook on consciousness. But of course, I'm a philosopher, so I'm curious of what you think as the one who's actually doing the science. Is my assessment of this that we're kind of hoping for a transition like this, similar to what we saw
Yes,
with attention?
so I completely agree that we don't yet have a consensus in the field about what's the most promising theory, not even like, what's a valid theory. However, I think this is a difference between you and me being a humble boots on the ground neuroscientist. Um, so I come from a very empirical background.
Mm-hmm.
So I personally don't think that theories should be the yardstick for measuring the maturity and the success and the promise of a field. I know that, from philosophy coming from a different, angle, you might think that theories are the yardstick for measuring, where the field is. So take some examples here from neuroscience. There are multiple topics that were studied in neuroscience for years, sometimes decades, with a lot of careful experimental work, where a body of strong empirical foundation is built up, and then some emerging theories became a wide consensus within that subfield. And sometimes what happens is that there are frameworks put in place first, like terminologies and frameworks and classification about a particular phenomenon before like theories become really take over to talk about the mechanistic underpinnings of that phenomenon.
Exactly. Hold on. Can I just
yeah.
I want to agree with you 100%. Obviously, what you're saying is very sensible. But I said theories, but I also said controversies. So like like what you would want to include, the way I was thinking about your introductory textbook, not just theories, but like which things you want to address. Like, for example, in some introductory textbooks on the section on consciousness, there's just stuff about sleep and dreams. And that's like their section on consciousness. In a different book, their section on consciousness is about IIT. And that's all they have. In a third book, their section on consciousness mentions global workspace theory and nothing else. And it's like, okay, great. I'm not saying you should have all the theories. What I'm saying is like, we don't know what even should be the topic matter of a cognitive neuroscience textbook, but we do in attention. We know how to write that introductory chapter in a way that kind of captures the current state of the field. And I'm just wondering if we are able to do that in consciousness science as well.
I think we are at a place where we totally should be able to do that. Like, for example, ASSC represents contents of consciousness research, states of consciousness research, theoretical work, empirical work. I completely agree with you that introductory textbooks that only cover a particular theory or only cover a particular topic, like say, sleep and dreaming, or only perception and confidence, like those obviously are only tackling subsets of topics relevant to consciousness.
Right.
No doubt about that. And that's being rectified now with some leading efforts contributed by lots of people for this new scientific study of consciousness volume that is currently being I guess getting close to production. I guess
I know.
in the final stages, you probably know about it, right? So that's a good example.
It was held up, or I was contributing a chapter with Steve Fleming and Axel Clemens.
Yeah, great. So I think there are certainly examples where a partial view is being used, but I don't feel like we need to be too bothered by that, because from what I see, we have a blossoming field represented by ASSC, a very healthy scientific society with our annual meetings. And I think everyone can see that, states of consciousness, contents of consciousness, perception, volition, conscious memories and conscious emotions, dreaming, psychedelic states, all of these topics fall within the umbrella topic of consciousness. The way I think about it is that so I have this graph in some of my talk slides, which is that for the last 10 years, the relationship between consciousness science and cognitive science is a bit like cognitive science being here and consciousness science being here.
Yeah.
And cognitive science is represented by, for example, CNS, Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and consciousness science by ASSC. There is some crosstalk between the two. But the way I think about it is really that we need to move towards a situation where both sociologically and scientifically, the two are much more integrated, with consciousness being right at the center of integrate, at least an integrate component
Right.
of all of the subfields of cognitive neuroscience. And I've written about this in a couple of my opinion articles, like, all of the cognitive neuroscience topics, from perception to, you mentioned attention, to memory, to emotion, to executive control, thinking, all of these different mental faculties have a dimension of conscious versus unconscious processing.
Exactly.
So I think it's for historical reasons, basically cognitive neuroscience and especially cognitive neuroscience, but also cognitive science to some extent emerged as a pushback against the behaviorist school that was prevalent before then. And so because of that dynamic, cognitive neuroscience has kind of the mainstream cognitive neuroscience for decades shied away from the words of conscious and unconscious. Right. So like, even though, the words like conscious and unconscious were widely used by founding fathers of psychology and, memory field, like William James, Larry Squire, and Otoven, then, people started trying to avoid those words and using words such as explicit and implicit, which really mean exactly the same thing. So let's just, taking memory as an example. I think by embracing this distinction between conscious and unconscious processing and thinking about, what's conscious, what's unconscious in this different mental faculty, the investigation of these different mental faculties, we will gain a lot. And by building stronger bridges between cognitive neuroscience, mainstream cognitive neuroscience, and consciousness science, we will learn a lot.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. So it's nice to hear that there's also, this group of people that's working, because there is like some overlap between like the CSS and the ASSC. And I'm also thinking of the VSS, the Vision Sciences Society, which is becoming a cool place.
Yeah, CNS, Cognitive Neuroscience Society.
Yeah, and the CNS as well.
Yeah.
So these areas, it would be nice if we saw a lot of overlap between them. And you do currently, because some of the talks that you see, like at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, are also talks you would see at the Vision Science Society or the CSS, and vice
absolutely.
versa.
More and
so
more.
there is more crosstalk, and more of that is better, I would say. So it's good to see that we're in this area. Now, I think that when you mentioned that there's all these thriving areas, the content and so forth and so on, some people have, said informally, well, why use the word consciousness at all? It just muddies the water. Like, just say you're studying perception, or just say you're studying attention. So how would you respond to someone who thought that maybe, adding consciousness is just muddying the waters or opening the door to unclear thinking, as opposed to just saying something like attention or perception or whatever, decision making?
I think the reality is exactly the opposite to that view. Adding consciousness clarifies things rather than muddies things. I at one point I had this ongoing discussion with a colleague at NYU who studies perception in an animal model about what's the definition of perception. And perception, if you ask a working neuroscientist from maybe a background where consciousness is really something that's in the philosophical domain and they don't want to battle with it, then perception is essentially behavior.
Right.
The animal's behavior triggered by some sensory input, and that's why we have perceptual decision making as a very large and vibrant field, because that's basically studying detection, discrimination, behavior, and so on about sensory input, and from easy to very difficult sensory tasks. But I kept making this point that if I talk to a person on the street about what is perception, right, like, the person would say, what I see, what I hear.
Exactly.
And that's essentially what they consciously experience. And this distinction is so essential to both human studies and animal studies and translational studies, because if we don't ask which aspect of behavior is conscious and which aspect of behavior is automatic, like, reflex or complex reflexes, series of processes in the brain that's nevertheless, kind of automatic,
right,
then we would not know which neural mechanisms are contributing to conscious experience that sometimes bother people, like in clinical conditions,
Yes.
where somebody has chronic back pain. And, if it's not conscious, it doesn't bother the person. So if we don't think about the conscious unconscious distinction, then, for example, we could have animal models of painful sensations where we have no idea if the animal is actually experiencing the feeling of being hurt, actually bothered by it, or it's just some sort of automatic or even complex reflex.
Right.
And so we might be treating a behavior without treating the experience, right? Like eventually if we develop some drug that treats that, that paw withdrawal behavior, that, you poke the animal withdraws its paw. If we might have some medicine that changes that behavior, but if we are not changing the conscious experience, when we translate that into human patients, we're not going to have the next generation.
Exactly. And in fact, this is something that like Joe Ledoux has argued, and I was on a paper co-authored with him and some other folks trying to make this argument. He's been making this argument a lot longer than I have been involved. But still, the idea that we got to put the first person perspective, the conscious experiencer, back into psychology and cognitive neuroscience, especially when you're talking about translational stuff. Because everyone who's taken an SSRI knows it doesn't make you feel better, but it does change your behavior. And so that's, kind of, we would say from our point of view, that's to be expected, given that all we did was change the behavior of rodents. We never asked them how they felt. And so all we ever should expect is that the behaviors change, because those are the systems we've been targeting without
so it's very important
to. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So what you were just saying made me remember that at this workshop that you mentioned that I organized, one of the recognitions, like topics that, one of the consensus points was that we need better behavior measures, metrics and tests, batteries for evaluating conscious experiences in animal models, precisely for the reason you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And this actually brings us directly to some of your own specific work, because I think, some of your stuff, I mean, you've done a lot of stuff, so it's hard to but one subset of the cool stuff that you've done is involving looking at decoding from the sort of whole cortical activity and trying to nail down under certain conditions when you can tell the difference between someone who is having an experience, erroneously attributing it to the object external to them, as opposed to them having no experience but thinking they do, which is a stymieing point. And I think you have a pretty strong empirical case in some of your work that you can distinguish some of these. So I wonder if first, maybe I fill in if you don't know which things I'm talking about, I'll fill in more details. But if you can go a little bit into this from what I've been saying, that would be great.
Yes, absolutely. So we have been tackling the question of what is the neural mechanisms for conscious perception, and we have been taking vision as our model system for quite some time. And the advantage there is that we have a lot of cool psychophysics, rigorous, precise psychophysics tasks we could use. The finding you just mentioned, indeed, that kind of resonates through several studies from our lab, both with techniques that give us a good spatial resolution and spatial view of where things happening in the brain, and also techniques that have a good temporal resolution that tells us what's the neurodynamics, what's the dynamical signature of the neural activity that relates to conscious perception. And we have found that there are a couple of results I could highlight here. One is that we use different paradigms where we could dissociate the physical sensory input from the conscious experience, from the experience by the participant, so that we could ask which neural activity relate to the conscious experience from trial to trial within the same individual when the sensory input is held constant. So again, with the thinking that we want to basically dissociate the unconscious processing triggered by the sensory input, more automatic reflexive processing, from the activity that directly underlies conscious experience. And specific paradigms we've used include like threshold level perception, vestibular perception, and others like prior guided perception. And we have been able to decode using, this is, I think what you were mentioning, using whole brain activity recorded by EEG or MEG in the relatively low frequency range. It's not super low, like basically less than 5 hertz, less than 6 hertz, so delta-ish. It's part of the 1/f activity, so not an oscillation, but a fluctuation. So we call it a potential, not an oscillation. And we call it slow cortical potential, following some of the old neurophysiology literature. So we found that when we take this activity recorded by scalp level non-invasive electrophysiological methods like EEG or MEG, we could decode or predict people's conscious experience from trial to trial in all these paradigms I mentioned. So that really was important to me, because I wanted to make sure that what we found is generalizable and reproducible. So it's not just sufficient for something to be reproducible, but it also has to be generalizable. If you have some finding and you change the paradigm slightly, it goes away. That's not robust. So, for example, with bistable perception, where like a cube and Rubin phase space, just very briefly to introduce it, in case some people don't know this, you have like these ambiguous figures. It's the same picture, like a cube with edges. And if you stare at it, you fix your eyes at the center of the image, your perception flips back and forth over time, seemingly stochastically, between the two alternative interpretations. And what we found was that with slow cortical potentials, SCP, recorded across the scalp, so basically a large-scale activity pattern in the SCP, we could decode at a given moment which experience the person is having, which is pretty cool, because if you think about the Necker cube, you have this 3D cube, it's seeing it from top down, seeing it from bottom up.
And it's randomly switching, right, in your perception.
Exactly. Exactly.
So can I just ask you really fast about these? Because I'm in the brain oscillations. When I was a graduate student, I was working in a lab. I almost considered switching to neuroscience, but working with animals was too hard, and I didn't know anyone was never exposed to any other research besides the EEG. But anyway, so I did some work in a lab of a guy who was in a postdoc position with Biyu and was interested in this neural synchrony kind of stuff. So I learned a lot about that. And I'm very interested in how these certain patterns can be thought of as carrying information, riding on other signals in the brain like theta waves, like gamma waves that are synchronized to the theta synchrony in the hippocampus, seem to me to be good candidates for like information being transferred to the cortex, because you can see the kind of anyway. So I like thinking that way, but the slow cortical potential that you're talking about kind of supersedes or transcends all of these brainwave things that we're talking about, or at least that's what I'm thinking here, that what you're saying. So I'm wondering, can you tell me a little bit more about what is the relationship between this slow cortical potential that you're recording and decoding from, and these other things that I'm more familiar with, like gamma band oscillations and theta in single cell EEG and things of that nature?
Yes, absolutely. So I would say that there have been two conceptual changes in the electrophysiological field since like the period you were talking about.
Hey,
you were
are you calling me old?
No, no.
Okay.
Well, you worked on it for a while and then you switched to philosophy.
Yes,
so
it's true.
It's the same when I was doing my PhD, let's say. Yeah, so the mindset was the same, like, maybe just a few years before I was doing my PhD. So I'm just filling in you about, the development of the field since you switched to philosophy. So one is that it used to be thought that oscillations are the thing. That's how, the basically, it used to, people used to think that, brainwaves were all full of oscillations and it's just oscillations.
Right.
So that's what I was taught when I was in grad school, honestly. And actually that was my third empirical paper in neuroscience, was about how oscillations is just the tip of the iceberg, and the vast majority of spontaneous activity is not oscillatory. It's at the time, we didn't have the word aperiodic yet. That was a new word that was invented more recently. So at the time, I called it arrhythmic, so like a lack of rhythm. And it's, widely known as 1 over F, because it gives you the 1 over F power spectrum. Right. It's fluctuation, not an oscillation. It's irregular, and which actually fits very well with the Poisson firing patterns of neurons, right? Like when you record single neurons, they're not just clock-like clicking, right? Like they're not clock-like, but they are irregular, so they're Poisson firing, and that fits with the 1 over F activity. So the first thing is, I published that paper in 2010, a long time ago, so that paper was about how 1 over F activity, which was widely thought to be noise and traditionally routinely filtered out in neuroscientific studies, actually is well organized, has a rich spatial temporal organization, changes during task, like from rest to task, there's a change, and changes with state of arousal. So if you compare wakefulness and sleep, it changes. And it likely has functional significance. And so that's the first important realization in the field. And the second is that it used to be thought that synchrony was the way that we could look at communication between different regions, and it's just synchrony, right. Coherence. And that's when, for example, there was this idea back in around 1990, late 80s, that coherence of gamma oscillation was they saying that underlied conscious perception, because it was thought that solved the bounding problem. But we now know that synchrony is, synchrony alone is a very simplistic view of thinking about how different brain regions communicate. It's much richer than that. And there have been some wonderful methodological developments recently to allowing us to use these different electrophysiological approaches, like field potentials, EEG, MEG, intracranial recordings, that goes beyond just looking at coherence or synchrony to look at how different regions interact with each other. So methodologically, we have a much better toolkit, more complex, more sophisticated toolkit to look at interactions between regions.
But that's great. But is it that?
Okay, sorry, I haven't answered your key question about SCP, right?
Right, exactly. So I was just going to say,
I went on like a digression. Yeah.
But I just wanted to say on that synchrony point, though, before we get to the SCP, it's still, is it wrong? Are you saying that now it's wrong to say that synchrony plays some role? Because I don't think about, I'm not talking about consciousness.
No, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that synchrony alone would give us a very incomplete picture.
Yes, I agree. But like, for example, if you're thinking about how the hippocampal formation is broadcasting information to certain parts of the cortex, and you're looking at CA1, CA2, dentate gyrus, all that stuff, and you're following the projections, and they go to the cortex, and then you see that during sleep, there's a kind of, wave pattern which is time locked to the gamma range, that those findings are still significant and suggest that this is playing, that maybe this is thought, you could think of this as broadcasting information, even if it's only part of the picture or a weak part of it. Are you saying that that's an incorrect way of thinking about those findings?
I'm just making two simple points. One is that the oscillation is a small proportion of electrophysiological activity recorded from the brain in the form of field potentials. And the second is that there are other ways to assess communication beyond synchrony. I'm not saying that synchrony of oscillation is not real. I'm not saying it's not a thing or it's wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that that's only a small part of the full picture. But back to your question about ICP. So so I was mentioning about
it's SCP, right?
SCP, so slow cortical potential.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So I was mentioning about some empirical studies that we did that found ICP to correlate with conscious perception, be really in our hands, and this has been reproduced by a few other labs. It's the strongest neural correlate, strongest neural signature that affords trial to trial, single trial level, predictive power for conscious perception. We had this really nice study in 2017 in publishing PLOS Computational Biology, where we used a threshold level perception paradigm. So a Gabor patch that's titrated to the individual participants' perceptual threshold. So across trials, sometimes it's consciously perceived, sometimes it's not.
Right.
We had a very data-driven approach there, where we just took the MEG signal and filtered in different frequency bands, SCP and theta, alpha, beta, gamma. And for every frequency band, we extracted both the raw filtered activity and the amplitude envelope. So basically, how big that oscillation is at activity is band filtered activity is at a given moment. So its power. So what we found was that if we just take the filtered SCP activity, we could predict at a single trial level in every subject whether conscious perception was successful or not, significant above chance. And that predictive power was there even before the stimulus was presented to the participant. Right. So the pre-stimulus enabling brain state effect, or pre-existing brain state effect, which I think is very important to understand better.
This is kind of a really cool finding where you try to explain like how you could have like a criterion bias or something like that, and how these pre-existing dynamics in the brain will determine what trajectory the system goes into.
Exactly. And then in higher frequency ranges, we couldn't do that decoding. It was much lower, much lower than what we could in the SCP range. And then in the best-stable perception case, that we also found a really beautiful pattern where ICP allowed us to decode the content of perception, which view of the nickel cube you are seeing, like Rubin face-based illusion, whether you are seeing the base at the center or the two faces at a given moment in time. And when we found that, you asked about oscillations earlier, and we found that oscillations had a distinct role in that task. So if we extract the moment-to-moment power of alpha oscillation, basically, how big that alpha oscillation is, the amplitude, the peak-to-peak amplitude, essentially, that predicted how long a percept would last, but had no correlation with the content of perception.
Interesting.
So that means that those oscillation power basically modulated how stable a particular conscious percept is. And that makes sense because we know that the power of alpha oscillation over posterior cortex, occipital-temporal cortices, is an index of the state of cortical excitability.
Right.
So you close your eyes, alpha goes up, right? So higher posterior alpha power is correlated with a more inhibited cortical state. And in this best-stable perception task, if it has been shown before that if GABA, like the inhibitory neurotransmitter in the cortex, in visual cortex, is higher, then the percept duration tends to be longer because the winning neuronal group is better able to inhibit or suppress the alternative neuronal group. And it takes longer for that adaptation to set in and for the other one to win over. So that was, psychologists love double dissociations. So this was an example of double dissociation we found in a neuroscientific study of conscious perception, where SCP encodes the content of conscious perception and alpha oscillation amplitude. I wouldn't say control, that's too strong a word, but at least it modulates the stability of conscious perception.
It's a cool finding. So the what I guess I have two questions. One is just the still, what is the SCP? Like, what physiologically is it that are you measuring? I understand like electrophysiologically what you're measuring, but what biologically is it that's producing this?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you raised that question. So the cortex is a layered structure. Just review some of the basics that
Yeah,
will
good.
for any audience that's
It still
not
has
familiar
six
with
layers,
this.
right? That hasn't changed.
Neocortex,
Yes.
yes.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Um,
Not
yeah,
allocortex.
sometimes I tell like high school students or undergrads, freshmen, like it's like a layered chocolate cake with the pyramidal neurons looking like Hershey's Kisses, right? Like
Yeah, that's
with
right.
the thing sticking up at the top. Okay, so the right, so you have the layered neocortex and these electrodes on the surface of the cortex, either it's intracranial or non-invasive like EEG, MEG, we are able to record these signals because pyramidal neurons are oriented in the same way,
Right.
So all the pyramidal neurons, they have their apical dendrites going up to the top, and then their axons, either intracortically or goes to subcortical regions. And pyramidal neurons cell bodies, there are largely two groups. One group of pyramidal neurons cell bodies are in layer 2, 3, and they send their apical dendrites to layer 1 to the top. And another group of pyramidal neurons, their cell bodies are in layer 5, and they send their apical dendrites to the top.
Okay. And the layers all have different functions too, right? Like one's an afferent input and some's processing and some's output.
There is a canonical microcircuit. That's exactly like functions is I guess I hesitated because function the definition of function is up to the whoever you're talking to. So but there is a microcircuitry, canonical microcircuitry that's repeated throughout the cortex. And I just want to quickly inject here that that's why in my 2023 TICS paper, I made a point that all the different cortical regions can, in principle, support conscious awareness. They all have the same microcircuitry. They're all highly connected. That's a separate discussion.
Yes.
So you have the layered cortex, and the reason we are able to record EEG signals is because you have these pyramidal neurons that all have the same orientation. So they create what we call open electrical field.
Right.
So meaning that you have the apical dendrites going to the surface, and when current goes into the cell, it flows down the dendrite and goes to the cell body. And if a bunch of pyramidal neurons are all doing the same thing, you have an open loop. And that's how we can record the EEG signal from the surface. And so ICP happens. There is no mystery here. It's been studied for decades, like since the 1980s. So 40 years, 50 years, and it's well described through a whole lot of invasive studies in animal models and slice physiology. That basically when you have the apical dendrites that are excited, currents go into the cell, and if you have an electrode at the surface, you record this negative potential. And then if that synaptic barrage onto the apical dendrites lasts longer, then you would have this slow negative potential from the surface. And it was described by British and German neurophysiologists a long time ago, studying things like motor preparation, branch half potential. You must know about it.
Yeah.
And attentional preparation, contingent negative variation. So these are famous EEG potentials. They are subtypes of slow cortical potential. So branch half potential and contingent negative variation. These are all types of slow cortical potential. And they are all negative, right? Like scalp, surface negative.
Right.
And that's because you have the long-lasting synaptic inputs to the apical dendrites, which causes the surface potential to go negative. And that's also why oftentimes when a cortical region is recruited in a task, in the surface recording, you would see a slow negative shift in the potential. If you use the recording technique that does not have a awful high pass filter. And another thing I want to mention here is that it's not just cortical. So layer one is very special. My colleague next door, Bernardo Rudi at NYU, is one of the experts on layer one. Layer one is the only layer of the cortex that does not have cell bodies. It only has axons and dendrites.
I didn't know that.
And it's very cool. And
but that's
so
the layer
one,
you see when you open the scalp or open the skull.
It's very, very thin.
Yeah.
And so layer one receives input not only from intracortical connections from other cortical regions, but also massively from the non-specific thalamic input, so also called intralaminar. So there are several names for it. So matrix cells in the thalamus send their axons to layer one and activate the apical dendrites of pyramidal neurons. And matrix cells in the thalamus, so there are two types of cells in the thalamus that project to the cortex, matrix and core. So core cells are more common in first order thalamic nuclei that are basically thalamic nuclei that project to mid layers of the cortex. So yeah, classic thalamic relay cells. And the matrix cells, they are more prominent in intralaminar thalamic nuclei that and they project more to the much more the superficial layers, much more in layer one. And you must know Nico Schiff's beautiful work where the CL nucleus in the thalamus was stimulated and behavioral outcome in patients with disorders of consciousness was improved.
Yes.
So the CL nucleus is part of the CM central median nuclei of the thalamus and is very rich in matrix cells, or maybe completely composed of matrix cells. And it basically sends this diffuse projection to layer one of the different cortical regions. And essentially, basically, so what I wanted to say, to come back to my point of this layered cortical structure, the superficial layers of the cortex, especially layer one, gets input from non-specific thalamic input, as well as intracortical and intracortical connections. So, and when those synaptic inputs are long-lasting, that triggers surface recorded slow cortical potentials. And because this is a part of the cortical microcircuit that receives a lot of long distance connections. In this paper in 2009, when I first brought up the idea of slow potential being a good index of what we can measure about the cortical activity related to conscious awareness, the thinking was that it gives us an index of the happening in the neural circuitry that's really synthesizing, basically integrating information, our activity from different cortical and thalamic regions.
Exactly. Okay. So am I to infer from this then that we can say that the allocortex, having only 4 layers, doesn't have this top layer of just connections like layer one? Like, is that so or is the allocortex similar in this way as well, organized within this so that you would expect it, like you said, you could expect consciousness in any part of the cortex? I assumed you meant neocortex, but is it more generally any cortex on your view?
That, I think, is a really important empirical question that we need more work on. So I have been fascinated by the question of the relationship between hippocampus and the neocortex in consciousness. And at one point, it used to be thought that hippocampus was only involved in conscious memory, but that's substantially disputed, I guess, currently. So to come back to your question, I think there is a distinction, very important distinction that's often overlooked, between which cortical structures primarily contribute to conscious awareness in humans, and which cortical structures are, in principle, capable of supporting conscious awareness.
So, like if you were decorticated a human, they'd kick in or something.
Exactly. So that's the idea. So there are some very eloquent reviews out there about the ability for the subcortical structures to support residual rudimentary awareness. So there are unfortunately people born without cortex, like cortical agenesis, cortical atrophy, hydroencephaly. So there are some case studies where children, like they don't typically survive for very long, but sometimes they do survive, into
Yeah, it's really
childhood.
tragic. I know. Yeah.
Yeah, but there are some well documented behavior observations of emotion-like behavior toward caregivers.
Yeah, I talked to Mark
And
Solms, and he brought up a lot
yeah,
of these kinds of things. Yeah, exactly. The
yeah,
hydroencephalic.
yeah. So I we had this finding in healthy adult humans that may be somewhat relevant to this topic, where this was a study where we used a threshold level perception paradigm, and instead of gabor patches, we showed people object images, which could have different content, like cats and dogs and houses and man-made objects. And sometimes people perceive them, and sometimes they don't.
Right.
And this was a 7 Tesla fMRI study, so we could see the subcortical regions with exquisite details. And we found that when people consciously recognized what's in the image, there was heightened activation of cortical regions and heightened deactivation of the default mode network. So cortical regions, the pattern you see is strengthened. But we also saw strengthened activation in subcortical regions and thalamus, and beautifully in all of the neuromodulatory centers in the brainstem. So locus coeruleus.
But you could
etc.
not record. You couldn't decode from those subcortical.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you read my papers.
Yes,
so
I
we
did.
could not. And so that led us, but we could decode the content in the
From the
cortex, just to
cortex.
round out the story. We could decode from the cortical regions, even the deactivated ones, but we could not from subcortical regions after we matched, everything, our eye sizes and everything. So this led us to the idea that subcortical regions are more of this generic switch-like signal that helps the cortex maintain the information-rich signal in the cortex. And it fits with some of the animal studies out there, where there were some beautiful working memory studies in rodents showing that the thalamus had this switch-like signal that doesn't contain any content signal about what you are holding in your working memory.
Yeah.
Like it helps the cortex, PFC, to maintain that content-rich signal.
Yes.
So this observation, even though it's in a very different context, adult healthy human subjects, I think fits with the hydroencephaly cases we were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
Because the idea is that so I think the cortex is able to support this enriched awareness. And in normal cases, neurotypical human subjects might especially rely on the cortex for their conscious awareness. But if you take that away, subcortical structures may still be able to support rudimentary awareness.
It makes sense because the brain is full of redundant systems and
Exactly.
slapstick architecture, which looks like a mess. And it is, I try to tell my students this all the time, but you look at in the textbooks and you see the diagrams and everything looks nice and neat, but you ever see a slice of brain under an electron microscope, you realize, it's not as neat as, it's really messy. So even the idea that these systems are separate, I'm very open to the idea that we need to rethink some of this stuff. But still, it's nice to see that you can distinguish the activity at the cortical level from the subcortical level and make these kinds of distinctions. And now that I'm thinking about it, it makes me realize some of your other work. I had a second question I was going to get to, but now I'm distracted. But it makes me see that your work on decoding on the role of the prefrontal cortex in ambiguous figures, for example, how it fits in with this general idea that sort of part of what I'm hearing you argue is that we should kind of move away from the traditional picture of the architecture of the cortex as being separated in this way and look to these kind of unifying processes like slow cortical protections that kind of supersede or transcend visual area versus cognitive area and just kind of work at that level, because that's why we maybe find face responsive cells in the prefrontal cortex, which someone might go, that's weird, but on your view, that's kind of to be expected given all these things we've been saying about the cortex.
Yeah, so I'd like to add 2 points to that. One is that I don't think SCP is all there is to conscious perception, conscious awareness. I think if we only focus on ICP, that would be a mistake.
Okay.
Because ICP was brought up as a premier neural signature we should look at, partly because in humans we have access to EEG-like signals. If we want temporal resolution, right? It's very hard to record single neurons. Right. And I do not think that we should only think about potentials, electrical potentials. We need to think about what neurons are doing. We need to, for example, put together models about thalamocortical structures, networks, different cortical regions, and the computations of, computation is, I have mixed feelings about the word computation, but the actual, the mechanisms of the information transfer, information transformation, information transmission, basically what the neurons are doing. So I think SCP is one level of mechanisms that can help a lot with, especially the non-invasive techniques we have in humans. But we can't stop there. As neuroscientists, we want to dig deeper into the mechanisms. So that's the first point I wanted to add. Okay. And the second point is that, yes, I do think that we shouldn't be thinking about different cortical regions or even networks or cortical systems or brain systems in silo. Like we shouldn't be thinking about each of them in isolation. But one thing that I mentioned in this 2023 article is that we should think about the neuromechanism for each type of awareness. And so, for example, like conscious thinking versus conscious perception versus conscious volition or agency, and conscious memory recall, conscious emotions, all of these different conscious experiences, they have their own individual set of neuromechanisms that will differ. We know will differ. There's no doubt about it. In terms of which neural regions, like which brain regions circuitry, which brain circuits are most crucial for those different experiences, right? So just based on all of the neuroscientific findings we have now, by now it's very no doubt that they involve overlapping but different neural circuitry. And so I think so I've been advocating for the boots on the ground kind of empirical approach where we tackle each of these topics, these questions without prejudice, without thinking one is more important than the others for understanding conscious awareness. And we build up a stronger empirical foundation, and then we can examine, are there common computational principles, for example, across these different types of conscious awareness, or architectural principles.
Right. It's like a flipping it around instead of starting with what kind of computational principles and then looking for those, and looking instead at the different kind of conscious phenomena, and then afterwards trying to extract something out that may be common between them. That's what I hear you as saying, and I think that's an interesting approach. And also, it's like it makes me realize, I was thinking, yeah, a lot more progress on the neural correlates of consciousness probably would have been made by now if a lot of these other areas of neuroscience hadn't artificially subtracted consciousness out of what it was they thought they were trying to explain. Which is sort of touching on that thing we were talking about earlier. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't quite thought of that before. Interesting. Okay, so I wanted to come back to rewind way back to our beginning of the discussion about slow cortical potentials, because one of the things that struck me when I was reading this paper of yours was that how you were painting a picture as though in neuroscience there was a time when people sort of thought the activity of the brain was stimulus driven, like almost entirely. And then the discovery of the default mode network was kind of, or like spontaneous activity, the whole kind of idea of it was like kind of surprising to neuroscientists. But I don't know if I was reading that into what you were writing, or so. Is that an actual how you would describe the transition, that this discovery, that because you were describing the idea of the stimulus interacting with the pre-existing spontaneous activity as being a kind of novel thing, and I was like, yeah, wouldn't that be, isn't that? But I'm not saying it's not. Anyway, yeah, I found that to be very surprising that there was a time in science when they would have thought that, if that was the case, or I might have been misunderstanding the point. So yes, that's my question.
I think you're not wrong. There is a long and illustrious intellectual tradition to thinking about spontaneous activity and the brain always being active. One of my former NYU colleagues who has retired recently, Rodolfo Linus, wrote
Yeah,
a book about it.
exactly right.
And yeah, so yeah, exactly. And the yeah, so but neuroscience in neuroscience, what happened was that for a very long time, we're talking about like 20 years ago or before 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
it was people didn't know how to analyze this spontaneous activity, right? So when you look at from trial to trial and you are trying to explain the brain's processing of the stimulus to generate certain behavior, and the pre-stimulus activity, it varies all over the place from trial to trial. And so for a long time, people legitimately averaged across trials to extract that evoked activity,
Right.
stereotypical evoked activity that's the same across trials. And then I think to a large extent, led by the resting state revolution in fMRI, there has been, basically across the board attitude shift about this, again, about how brain state matters. So in animal field, it's often called brain state. People call it brain state. And in human field, my lab and others often call it spontaneous activity, pre-stimulus activity, but we are really talking about the same thing. And it's widely recognized now that brain state before stimulus input all over the place, as you would expect from a psychological or philosophical perspective. Just right. So I think we do have a better handle on how to analyze our data to bring that into the picture. So I think this also to come back to the main theme of this podcast, which is about consciousness science and how we should go about doing consciousness science.
Right.
I think it has important lessons for us as consciousness researchers as well, because the mentality used to be that we need to isolate,
Right.
and take away the prerequisite and try to remove everything that's not that minimally sufficient
Exactly.
neural mechanism.
Yeah.
And the problem is that myself has written about this, Tim Ben, Jakob Hoy has written about this, that minimally sufficient is difficult to pin down and potentially conceptually misleading.
Right.
Because that pre-existing brain state may be necessary and often is necessary for the agent to consciously perceive something. And if
it
you
may
just
bias,
isolate,
as you've shown in your work, it may bias what happens once the stimulus comes in, which is like,
exactly.
It seems sort of like in retrospect, like you would have like duh, but it's like it's amazing to be able to see it actually happening in the work that you're presenting.
Exactly, yeah. So we need to understand the full mechanism. So that's something like I think alternative to the minimally sufficient NCC paradigm is that we need to understand the full mechanism, from the start to the trajectory to what happens afterwards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm mindful of the time here. I know I'm pushing my limits, but I wonder if I could just ask you one more thing, if you could be tolerant, because I wanted to ask about the way in which you, it's not this particular study we've been talking about, but in a different study where you were looking at ambiguous figures and the role that the prefrontal cortex is playing there. And so there was the main finding is very cool, but there was something in the study itself I thought was very interesting, which was that you were presenting on the one hand, these things near threshold, so people can see them sometimes. Sometimes it's unconscious, but also you present a scrambled stimulus, which preserves a lot of the same overall characteristics statistically. So then you have a nice way of distinguishing when a person has a false alarm in this case, when they actually have an experience, when there was a scrambled image. And so I thought that was a really cool innovation and an argument that you made in that paper for that this is actually perceptual as opposed to something cognitive. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that, because I just think it's really a cool thing. Do you know what I'm referring to, or do you need to fill in a little bit more?
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about your terminology of perceptual versus cognitive here, because I always get hung up on that when philosophers talk about perceptual versus cognitive.
I just meant
NYU,
experiential.
yeah. Yes, right. So I think it's experiential. Yes, and right. So what we ruled out was a button press mistake, that they happened to press the wrong button, telling us that they saw something. So, right, the task was that press one button if you saw something meaningful, another button if you saw something that's just an abstract noise, like a noise pattern. And so what we ruled out was that they didn't happen to press the wrong button there. And when they said, I saw something meaningful, they genuinely saw something meaningful, because they reported what they saw matched with some low-level features in the image that could bias towards a certain perception.
So would you be reluctant to say that when they that what you ruled out was that they made a judgment, just merely a judgment, as opposed to had an experience? Are you reluctant to say that?
Right. So we ruled out it was just a criterion effect. Yes.
Okay.
So if that's what you mean, so we
Yes.
ruled out that it was just. So we confirmed through the behavioral analysis that they confirm is most likely. They
Yes,
most likely
exactly. It's a good empirical
had an
case,
experience of meaningful, seeing something meaningful, even though the stimulus was a pure noise pattern.
Yeah.
And the cool finding there from the neuroscientific side was that we found that in those cases, there was strong engagement of higher order prefrontal regions. So dorsal anterior cingulate and a region we called the inferior frontal junction, which is part of the ventral lateral prefrontal cortex. Those two regions were activated more to the scrambled pictures than to the real pictures. Which was really non-trivial finding, because the scrambled pictures had weaker sensory input. The sensory input was scrambled noise, and the real images had an object image embedded in them.
Right.
So these regions were activated more to the scrambled pictures, and that cannot be explained by it's when the sensory input is weaker, so it's not a sensory input bottom-up effect, and also, we ruled out that it was just a task difficulty effect,
Right.
because those regions' activity patterns matched with the scrambled pictures were generated from object pictures. We scrambled object pictures to create the scrambled noise pictures. So the regions allowed us to decode which original object category the scrambled pictures came from, and that matched pretty well with what people hallucinated, what content they perceived. So it's suggestive that those regions are sending this top-down template to visual regions where this top-down template has a guess about the content of the sensory input when the actual sensory input is really impoverished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So that's one cool way to interpret those findings, and I think that it's very so. But the kind of thing that I wanted to ask you a question about that in a second. But the first thing I want to kind of point out is the thing that you were saying is that when the image is scrambled, and a person says, "I see something," you can decode the image content that was scrambled from the brain activity. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Exactly.
So it means we could decode the
scrambled.
Exactly, the image content that was scrambled. Yes, from brain activity.
Sorry, I said it in a weird way.
Exactly right. Yes.
Sorry, I said it in a weird way. But yes, so that's That's very cool. So that does seem to me to suggest that when the person says, "Oh, I saw this image," that they really did have an experience as of that image,
Right. Right.
even though what was on the screen was a scrambled thing. And I thought that
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
was because a lot of times you will hear philosophers, people like Ned Block, who will say things like, "Well, how do we rule out that they weren't just, they didn't have an experience of a scrambled image that they mistakenly took to be an image of something meaningful." So that maybe what you're actually decoding isn't experiential, but is rather some kind of some cognitive judgmental state in a philosophical sense of not being experiential, but just being like a sentence, like "that's a swan" or "that's a face" or something. And so I
Yeah,
thought
I
that
would
this
say if
argument was
they,
pretty
yeah,
convincing as a response to
yeah,
people like Ned on this kind of case.
yeah. So I would say that if they mistook the image as something meaningful, I strongly believe they genuinely experienced that as seeing something meaningful.
Uh-huh.
So this phenomenon, false alarms to these scrambled pictures are widely considered to be a potential model for understanding hallucinations.
Right.
Of course, the neurotypical brain and the where you do have hallucination, there are a lot of differences. But a lot of people are interested in using this phenomenon to understand false perceptions. I guess we could at least, I think they could be called false perceptions at least, if not
Interesting. And
hallucinations.
I mean, we have a lot of evidence in psychology and cognitive science generally that there's kind of expectation effects and top-down influences. I mean, perception is a top-down phenomenon, generally speaking. It's an interpretation of the sensory stream. And so I guess the surprising thing here, or not surprising, but the interesting, like you said, from neuroscience, is that it's the prefrontal cortex, which looks like it's only selectively involved when there's something hard happening at the sensory level that the system can't figure out on its own. It kind of steps in, figures out what's happening, and then imposes a template on it, resolving the issue. And you can see that in the activity responding to the input from the prefrontal areas, which is very cool. So my question is, why think it's a template? Because some people we may know, might want to say, well, the experiences associated with that activity in the prefrontal cortex is exactly, wouldn't that kind of align with these results as well, as opposed to it sending a template? It might just be correlated with the experience itself, and then that may be the thing which changes the activity at the sensory level. So I'm wondering, like,
Yeah,
what
so I think in cases like this where we have content specific activity in PFC and content specific activity in visual cortex,
yeah.
I don't see a way to empirically adjudicate which activity in that situation is directly underlying conscious experience. Could be all of them, right? So I don't think like this breaking apart and looking at each brain region in isolation approach is the right way to think about it.
Right, it might be
And
them both. Well, don't you think you could use something like optogenetics or something to selectively deactivate like one of these parts and then see what happened to the experience? Wouldn't that, like, if you could optogenetically deactivate the
right,
V4 activity as opposed to
yeah.
the
Right,
prefrontal
right.
activity?
That would be a good experiment to do indeed. Like, for example, if you, took away, you deactivate visual regions and you only have that template from prefrontal regions, while the false perception will still happen. I think that would be a great experiment to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe your pessimism that there's no empirical way is just like we haven't been able to
Oh,
successfully do
yes,
it
yes.
yet.
Sorry, I would completely rephrase that. Yeah, just yes, completely based on that correlational study. Yes,
I see.
absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought you were saying something stronger that you didn't see a
Sorry.
way
Yeah,
to
yeah.
resolve
Thank you
it.
for catching that.
Yeah. No
Yeah.
worries. Okay. Good. So I completely agree with that. And man, there's a million interesting things that I want to bring up, but we'll have to bring you back some other time because like you probably have real work to do rather than talk to philosophers all day. So I just
This has been great fun.
Yeah, it has been great fun. And I just always like to end by asking at the last question if there's anything which you wanted to bring up at the end. And the answer can be no. But just in case we haven't touched on something that you wanted to bring up, I like to give the possible.
thanks for organizing this series. I think this is fantastic.
Well, I'll take that. That's very cool. I appreciate your time, and I'm sorry for the scheduling. You've been very gracious
Oh
coming
no,
back.
I'm sorry too. It's
Oh
my
no,
fault.
don't.
But
Yeah, we're both sorry. So hopefully it was worth it. And I do want to get your kind of take. Maybe my fire. You didn't want to bring up anything, so I'll bring up one last thing, just about whether you're sort of thinking about the brain and these. Is your hesitation about computation related to, like, are you on the side of AI consciousness, or are you skeptical about that? Do you think that's relevant to these things that we've been talking about? I know that's a whole can of worms, that's separate, and we don't really have time to get into it. But I'm just curious, like some of the things you've been saying have made me wonder, like, do you have like a take on this, or do you not?
yeah, so a very deep question at the
At the
last
bell,
minute
yeah,
also.
I
the um, I'm hesitant to use the word computation to describe all of these cellular and what the neurons and neural circuitry are,
know.
are,
Yeah.
are doing, because I don't think compute is what the brain does.
I
Right, the
suspect, yeah,
brain
that's why I was
is
asking.
it may do something that's very similar to computation. That but I don't think that's, at least it's not the only thing. It's not what's there, what evolved to do, right? It evolved for adaptive behavior, for survival and reproduction, and what basically adaptive behavior. And yes, so then back to your the core of your question. I presume you're asking about my view on computational functionalism.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
in fact, I organized a symposium at ASSC in Tokyo on
Oh.
that exact topic. And I tried not to be pinned down on it by being the chair of the organizer and having other people debate the topic. But I organized it precisely because I think this is a really important question and a key fault line in our field, in basically where people sit on it. And my own view, I am open-minded, and I am not, a stand-on computational functionalism, functionalist. And but I also can't, I also don't, I can't prove the alternative view is correct.
Right.
So, but I think as a field, we should really be open-minded about this.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because I've always been a biological naturalist. I mean, I started out as an identity theorist in philosophy, which is just the view that the mind is the brain. And I still defend that view, the biological view. I've gradually kind of become more grudgingly open to the possibility of functionalism and computational functionalism generally. But I do kind of like to see that there are serious people who take the idea seriously, that maybe there's something beyond computation. Although also take seriously the idea that maybe it's just computation. So I do think I do think it's important to recognize that it's an open question, and that this whole idea of like what else could it be and don't be silly is kind of not helpful at this point. I don't know. Anyway, so it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I appreciate that. All right. On that note, I'll
All
let you off
right.
the hook. Thank you very much. And just hang around for 1 second. I'll say bye off the air. Other than that, thanks again for your time. I've been having a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. We're clear. We're free.